How do you be vulnerable as an executive? This is a real question a senior leader in my network asked me because he works in a business where he feels the executive team is incredibly stoic, there's not a lot of vulnerability, and he wants to change that. He wants to be a pioneer inside the business, bringing vulnerability as a critical resource. I think we all need to agree that all vulnerability is not created equal. And despite the good intentions, something that we have to be aware of as senior leaders, executives in the business, is what's the downstream impact of being vulnerable. There's a great article on Medium by an author named Jamie Martinez Bones that talks about authenticity and sincericide. When you have great intentions and you share something sincerely, a challenge that you're facing, that what happens when that becomes career suicide, what he calls sincericide. And so this is something very important to consider. If you want to bring more vulnerability as a part of your reputation as a leader, how do you do it most productively, especially as an executive? Because as an executive, the higher you go up in the organization, the louder your megaphone, the heavier your words, and you have to be very cautious of what you choose to be vulnerable about. Vulnerability, I want to create some different perspectives around vulnerability. There's a very big difference between being vulnerable with somebody and being vulnerable to somebody. And they're very different in this way. When you're vulnerable to somebody, you're just venting, you're offloading. And you may have good intentions, but if it's not specific enough, it can become a burden on the other person, especially inside the business. If there are implications to the department or the individual, it's going to carry a significant and possibly negative impact. So you're vulnerable to someone when you're venting and essentially just putting the burden on them. Being vulnerable with them is very different, and I'm going to give you a method to consider when you're being vulnerable to them. And to ensure that it doesn't erode your brand, your reputation inside the business. Consider the concept of executive or responsible vulnerability. It's responsible, it's intentional, and it's empathetic. And you might be thinking, well, isn't being vulnerable more about me? Well, consider this, especially if you're an executive. Know your audience. What's the level of vulnerability that you can bring? What are their biggest pains and what are their gains? And how might that distort the way that they perceive this information? You have to be aware of your audience as an executive. And so this is part of the responsible element of being vulnerable. It can be a very intentional tool to bond with others and build connections, which means you have to be vulnerable with them. A client of mine who's created a billion-dollar company says one of the most powerful things a leader can do is say, I don't know. But the way you say it is very important. If you say, I don't know in a state of overwhelm versus I don't know, but I'm certain if we put our heads together, we can come up with the greatest path forward. It might be easy to think that saying I don't know has people believe that you're incapable, but the way you say your words and use your words is going to make the biggest difference. So I don't know, let's come together and find the right solution is very different than a state of distress and overwhelm when you say I don't know. But here's a very specific method I guide leaders with that can be effective when it comes to creating vulnerability with someone. It's a simple process, but very effective. Think of AIR, the AIR acronym. Articulate your challenge. I come to you and I say, hey, I've got a challenge that I'd love your perspective on. Yes, you're being vulnerable with a real challenge, because tell me a leader that hasn't had a challenge, it would be the first time that I've seen one. So I come to you and I say, hey, I've got a challenge. I'd love your perspective on this. Then you invite someone to be your thought partner on this and ask them, when have you been in a situation or a space like this? And how did you get through it? And then here's the result. I think I want. So it shows them that you've given some thought to it. You're not just offloading it on them, but here's the result that I think I want from this situation. What would you do differently? This is executive vulnerability. You're still showcasing that you've got challenges. You're opening up to your peer, your boss, another leader inside the organization and inviting them to be a thought partner to solve your situation rather than save you from it. Give it a shot. That's executive or responsible vulnerability. Let me know how it works.